smooth on the map, never smooth on the map, never smooth. What you gonna do when you at, who you with, you ain't really about that, don't did, don't you?
Thank you for having me on, Mike. You know, it's an honor to be on first. I just hope I don't bomb it and mess it up going forward here. But no, thank you.
If the reviews go south, we're going to blame it all on you. That's it.
Fair enough. I serve House District 33, which is Randolph, Blackford counties complete, portions of Jay, Delaware, and Henry County as well. I also serve on the House Ways and Means Committee, Judiciary, and the Elections Committees are my 3 committee assignments.
Okay, great. What are some of the bills that you're passionate about that you had in the House, maybe that didn't get out, and maybe some of the ones that you did see get out of the House side and over to the Senate side, and maybe explain that process a little bit for people who don't really know how the legislative machine functions in Indiana?
Yeah, absolutely. So no, we all members of the House on long sessions. We have 10 bills that we can file. So I filed 9 bills, but we can. Those bills then get assigned to committee. Once it goes through the committee process, then that's when it gets to the floor for second reading, then third reading on final passage. So to get a bill moving out of committee, that's the first step. I had 3 pieces of legislation that made it out of committee. One of those didn't make it across the finish line, which is partisan school boards in the House. But the reason we didn't take it up for a vote on third reading, we had a bill coming across from the Senate. We had 2 parallel bills. The Senate already voted on the bill, so it's, that one's already moving. Let's just take that and run
focus
with
on
it.
that one.
Right. So that
so
bill's
the fact that yours didn't get out isn't a big deal because you're like, hey, we're still fighting the good fight.
Exactly.
With the Senate's bill.
Exactly. Yeah. It's essentially the same bill. Yeah. Some minor differences, but that bill is Senate Bill 287, which mirrors House Bill 1230. Similar concept.
So let's hit on that. Partisan school boards.
Correct.
So tell us the reasoning behind that, because typically when you say partisan anything, that's kind of a people sort of knee-jerk reaction is, we don't want partisanship, right? So, but why is this important?
Yeah, so my argument is we're really not making school boards partisan. They're already partisan. Yeah. All we're doing is providing transparency to the voters, so they have more information when they go to the ballot box on who they're voting for. And when you look at the R or the D label next to a name on the ballot, that's not the end-all be-all. I'm not saying just go and vote straight ticket Republican, straight ticket Democrat if you're a Democrat, but what I'm saying is that's a starting point. You look at, you see the Republican identification next to the name, you know that candidate has aligned with that party platform, those set of ideals and principles, and that's that starting point. Now you still need to go and do your individual research on the candidate, because not all Republicans are the same. I mean, there's 70 members of our caucus, and we have differences of opinions at times.
And not all Republicans are, how do we say, Republican?
Well, I'd agree with that too. There are quite a few in name only, aren't there?
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's not the ending point. It's just the starting point to give voters a little bit more information as they go to the ballot box. So they know who they're voting for.
Yeah, it's good, and it's getting pushback because I think the left that have kind of like weaseled their way into leadership within our schools or across the nation. I mean, this is not just an Indiana thing. We've seen some of the hottest politicized events and issues in the schools, right? And school board races. And the left knows the moment you can start to identify somebody based on the party platforms, they're going to start losing control of these schools because people don't want leftism in the schools. Right. I mean, leftism is high taxes. It's gender nonsense where boys can be girls and girls can be boys. And we know that's just foolishness. It's teaching things like CRT, which says America is inherently an evil nation. That's what the left they've hitched their wagon, their cart to, right? And so I feel like when we start seeing these R's and D's next to school board candidates, people are going to be like, I don't know if I want necessarily somebody with the Democrat ideology to lead the schools. And I think it's a great bill. I'm glad it's moving in the Senate. What's the likelihood that it will pass? The Senate's bill will actually pass the House and make it to the governor's desk for him to sign?
So I'm very confident. It's up for amended vote in committee on Wednesday, and then next week it'll be on the House floor.
Okay.
So I am confident. Still whipping the votes. It's not a done deal yet by any means, but I don't want to take anything for granted until that vote is tallied up on at the rostrum. But things are looking good, and I'm ready to get it across the finish line. But you hit on some great points. People need to remember that school boards, they're responsible for voting on and approving the largest budget in our community in most cases.
That's right.
Over 50% of the state's budget goes toward education. Then when you look at the property tax revenue, 45% of your property tax dollars goes towards your local school corporations as well. And that varies. If you're in an area with a referenda or a high tax rate, it could be upwards of 50, 60% of your property tax revenue goes towards the school corporations. So they have the largest budgets in the community, and they are in charge of approving the curricula that goes through the school corporation, setting that policy agenda. So it's very important we have good school board candidates.
It's a good thing to remember because it's just kind of a nice tool in your tool belt when people come at you in opposition of the partisan school board bill, to remember that school board members set policy and spend tax dollars.
Correct.
County council members set policy and spend tax dollars. City council members set policy and spend tax dollars. So we require county council and city council to have an R or D or an I or L next to their name. They have to identify some way, shape, or form. Why is it that we don't require that of school board candidates? And I was talking to a school board member the other day, and she's a friend of mine, and she just wasn't a big fan of this bill. And she said, well, school boards are more important because we deal with the kids. And I think that's a common sort of assumption that, well, because it's the schools, it's somehow more virtuous than the county council or state legislature. And I asked her, I said, well, let me ask a question. What's more important, the roads or the curriculum? Mm-hmm. If you're gonna stack it up on an importance level. She stopped, and she, after a second, she was like, well, probably the curriculum. I said, well, what happens if you don't have roads to be able to get to school? Then no one can study curriculum. And my point is that they're both equally important,
correct,
right? And so, but somehow we kind of have this, well, schools are more virtuous,
right,
just because they're schools. No, it's not. It's the same thing with police officers. Like, we know that there can be some bad police officers. Most of them are good, but there are some bad apples, right? We don't just give police officers a blank check because, they're police. We say, no, we want to hold you accountable. Same thing as with their schools. Hey, teachers, most of them are great. You know, my mom was a public school teacher. My grandpa was a public school principal. Like, I have a long history of benefiting from people in that public school setting. But you can't just give them a blank check and a blind eye.
Exactly.
Right?
Well, and because schools are so important, we do need to make sure that the voters know who they are electing, sending to these to represent them in these seats, so they're a true reflection of the community. There was a member that testified, or a gentleman that testified, that said, I was talking to a school board member, and they said, you'd be surprised to know my party affiliation. Well, we don't want to be surprised. We want to know how you're going to represent us when you go in. That's kind of the point.
It's hilarious. That's funny. That is a great standpoint that you just said there. Like, we don't want to be surprised, right? Like, and somehow they think hiding their true belief system is somehow virtuous. And it's like, no, it's deceptive is what it is. And people need to know who they're voting for. And I want to know as much as I can know about somebody, whether they're running for school board, state office, president of the United States. I want to know as much as I possibly can know so that I can, in good faith, cast my ballot for the right person.
Yep.
And so that's great. So that Senate bill number is what, if people want to call their reps?
That is Senate Bill 287, and it'll be heard in committee this week. I'm not sure when this podcast airs.
This will probably have already been heard when this comes out, but it will hopefully have passed committee by this point when people hear this, and then it's going to go to the floor for second reading.
Correct.
And so you can still call your representatives and say, hey, Senate Bill 287, we want you to support that on the floor.
Yes, sir.
Yep. Okay, great. Okay, what are some bills that you did get through the House, some of your bills that you're excited about and we need to know about?
Yeah, so House Bill 1531, it's a various immigrations bill. It does multiple things. The big thing is tightens up our sanctuary city language a little bit by removing the mens rea standard, make that a little bit easier to enforce for the Attorney General's office. It also requires law enforcement to honor ICE detainer requests. So if somebody has an ICE detainer, that law enforcement would be required to honor that request. And the big thing that it also, there's some data collection pieces as well. I want to make sure we know who is in the system, who is on the tax roll when it comes to, the welfare programs, Medicaid, when it goes to TANF, some of these programs.
What is TANF?
That's the food stamp program.
Yeah, just for people. Yeah, just for people.
So make sure on these welfare programs that are there illegal immigrants in the system, and so how much is it costing the state?
Yeah.
So we want to make sure we have that identifiable information.
So you're really going to get people to have, they're going to have to self-identify, or the system's going to have to identify if we're helping them and they're not here legally. So then we can really get a sense for where our tax dollars really going.
So I didn't get it completely in the weeds on how the departments are going to do it. We're just directing the department to collect this information and then report it back to members of the General Assembly or all statewide elected offices at their discretion. So you could if this bill passes, you'll be able to go to any of the basic welfare programs in the state, ask the director to make sure that information is provided.
Go back to the sanctuary city status. So your bill makes it harder for local municipalities to claim sanctuary status.
Correct.
Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So we want to. Yeah, we do not want sanctuary cities in the state of Indiana.
Okay.
So we're making.
I just want to clarify that because when you said it, it's like that could go either way. So we have a couple cities that are Democrat-led right now that have claimed sanctuary status. So I think Bloomington.
Correct.
Maybe up by Chicago, Gary, some of those the region areas. Maybe not Gary. I don't want to. If you haven't done it, I don't want to throw them under the bus. But I know Bloomington was one of those, and Attorney General Rokita has a lawsuit right now, even going after the sheriff of Monroe County, where Bloomington is. And so your bill would give a little bit more teeth to the AG to be able to go after.
Absolutely.
Officials.
And then if a city is still claiming to be a sanctuary city, violating the statute, at the end of the day, the governor would be able to revoke all funding for up to a year, including grants.
Nice.
So we want to make sure we can hold these cities accountable for violating the statute across the board. And then the very last piece is in employment. So it's already federally illegal to knowingly and intentionally hire illegal immigrants, but the feds have not done a great job of enforcing that. So what we're doing is creating a state penalty for knowingly and intentionally hiring illegal immigrants as well.
Yeah.
And then the enforcement category there would be through their business licensure. So it'd start with a warning, but then it would work its way up through suspensions of license, all the way up to a revocation of license.
Wow.
So that's a strong piece as well.
That's great. What do you say to people who are like, well, JD, it's not loving. The Bible says to love thy neighbor as thyself and to take in the aliens. And, how are you as a professing Christian, how can you, be so heartless to, file legislation like that? What do you say to somebody who says that?
Well, the Bible also says we have to follow law and order, and there's a process. I'm all for immigration and being welcoming and bringing in immigrants, but they need to follow the legal process. The problem at the southern border is we don't know who's coming in. We don't know what crimes they've committed, what they're bringing in with them, drugs. So I am compassionate to those that are in a foreign country, want to come to America and build a better life, but they need to do it legally.
Yeah.
That's the process.
It's good. I always tell people when they come at me with that sort of mindset, I'm like, how are we supposed to help somebody if we don't know they're here?
That's true.
And when you cross into our country illegally, we don't know who you are. We don't know you're here. We don't know what community you're in. How can we help you? And you're saying we need to help people. Okay, well, then we got to know who they are and where they came from and why they're here, and then we can help them. So follow the legal pathway. And that doesn't mean that we don't need reforms in the immigration system. I think there's a lot of broken pieces of our immigration system federally that needs to be fixed, but at the same time, it doesn't give you license to just go out and break laws. And I was having a conversation with a representative a few months ago on this, and he was for illegal immigration. And I just said, so is it breaking a law? Are we breaking law when someone comes across the border illegally? And he wouldn't really kind of answer the point, but basically I got him to admit, yeah, you're breaking the law. I said, okay, fine. If that's the system we live in, then I get to break laws that I think are unjust or that I don't like, and you can't be mad if then I start breaking certain laws and you start breaking certain laws, and at some point then we just become a system of anarchy. There is no law, right?
Absolutely.
And that's the danger of just kind of saying, well, this one is, it's okay for someone to cross the border illegally because they're trying to make a better life for themselves. Okay, well, it's okay for me to speed because I need to get to the grocery store so I can get food for my kids, right? Like, I mean, what's the, you got to be consistent here, right? So that's good. Hey, what are some of the bills that didn't make it out of committee in your wheelhouse that maybe you might file next year?
Yeah, so I've got three that are really that I'm passionate about. One, 10 Commandments in the classroom. So I'm still looking for a vessel there. So maybe I could find something the second half to insert that into a bill. So I'm not giving up there.
Okay, and that strategy, just real quick, what people they may not know, it's not done until we sign off and end the session. So there's ways to somehow slip language into bills that are somewhat germane, which means like-minded of the language you're trying to slip in. So if there's a school bill, you might be able to get the 10 Commandments language in there, and that would then require schools to put 10 Commandments as well as the Declaration and the Constitution are already supposed to be.
They're already in there.
Yeah, so this would be considered one of the founding documents, which Correct. It is, right? And it would be up in schools, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's great.
So I'm looking for a bill, more than likely a House bill that's in the Senate. So I work with some of my Senate colleagues to do that because the House has a little bit looser rules on germaneness than the Senate. But even if I could find a Senate bill while it's in the House, then it could be moved to a House bill later. There's a lot of jockeying that goes in at the very last weeks of session. That's why they call it making sausage, I guess, down here, because it gets a little messy. But there's a lot of moving pieces.
Yeah, that's good. I love that bill because the 10 Commandments are it's the law that Western civilization is built on. Our founders knew it. It's part of the founding history of America. And when, there has to be, if you have law, there has to be a moral lawgiver. And I always tell people who don't want the 10 Commandments in schools, I just say, okay, well then who gets to decide what's really right and wrong? Then it becomes a politician. Yep. And I don't know about you, but I want Donald Trump to decide what's morally right. I don't want Nancy Pelosi to decide what's morally right. I don't think you or I would do a good job of deciding what's morally right. And so there has to be a moral lawgiver, and really the only one who's good enough to do that is God himself. And that's what our founders believe. The laws of nature and nature's God is what the Declaration of Independence points to. And so, I was talking to David Barton a couple days ago. He's an American historian. He sent me this graphic. I think I forwarded it over to you. And it was what has happened in our schools since we removed the Bible teaching and prayer from our schools. And on every metric, whether it's teen pregnancy, whether it's violence in schools, whether it's test scores, everything has gotten worse since we removed the morality of what Western civilization has set on. But we try to bring something like that in, and then we get labeled Christian nationalist or, some, far right, extremist or something like that. I'm like, at some point we have to decide what's right or wrong. And if you think you can do a better job being God, go for it. But it seems like it hasn't worked for the last 40 years.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. And you're right. When you look at any metric across the board, when you take the Bible out of the classroom, when you take morals out of the classroom, there's just a breakdown. Yeah. Now you have people that can't even speak the basic truths of life, male and female, right?
I'm right there. How do we get? If you would have told me 20 years ago, honestly, if you would have told my grandparents, they were left-leaning Democrats. My grandpa was a principal in the public school system up in Illinois, and in the Chicago area. I'm telling you, if in 1995 I could have gone to my grandpa and said, "Hey, Grandpa, in 2025, your party, the party of the Democrats, will be pushing that boys can be girls and girls can be boys," he would have lost his mind. There's no way he would have ever said that that's okay. And he said, "No, we will never be that stupid," right? And yet, here we are. How did we get to be that stupid?
Well, without God.
Without God. I think that's it,
That's
right?
the answer.
Yep.
And so I'd like to get it back in the class. And there's really a long-term game plan with this too. I mean, it's about going back and reversing some of these early Supreme Court decisions that from the 1960s.
Yeah.
And we have court precedent that sets it up. The Lemon Test is no more.
Yeah, that's great.
I mean, that was the standard.
The Lemon Test,
that's been in place for years. But when the Kennedy case, the Coach Kennedy, that case that went to the Supreme Court, when he won that court case, the Lemon Test was struck down, and now it is historical precedent is the standard on what can be used on the public square.
So the Supreme Court said the long-standing historical precedent will be considered constitutional.
Correct.
Until it's proven otherwise.
Correct.
Whereas the Lemon Test said you have to prove that it's constitutional, or else we're not going to allow it in there.
Yeah.
So it just kind of makes it sort of the burden of proof now falls on the other foot, where it's like, hey, the Bible is a long-standing historical precedent in our schools. If you don't want it there, you've got to be able to prove that somehow this violates the First Amendment somehow, and there's really, you can't do that. I mean,
Correct.
First Amendment says that you're free to actually have faith and religion in the public square. Yeah.
And if you go back and look at the historical documents, the first textbook in America
Was the Bible.
Was the Bible, and then the first textbook beyond the first textbook of training, how to read and write.
Yeah.
It was based on the Bible. You start with Bible verses.
Yeah.
So the A is So you would.
When the Northwest Ordinance was created, it talks about public schools in the new territory, and it said, and these were the founding fathers. Many of the guys who wrote the Northwest Ordinance were guys who had a part in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And the Northwest Ordinance said 3 things we need to teach our children if they want to be good citizens. You have to teach them religion, morality, and knowledge, in that order, in public schools.
Correct.
And we got rid of religion in the 60s. Then morality was shortly removed, and now knowledge is going away. And so our founders were very wise in the sense like, hey, it's got to be rooted in these biblical truths, or else you won't even be able to teach the basic truths of the world to our kids. So I love what you're doing. What are some other bills that you're excited maybe to bring back next year or to?
Property taxes.
Oh yeah, we got
to
hit that one too because.
And I've got a bill that I'd like to bring back next year to build on what we're going to do. So obviously this year, I think we'll get to this in a minute. We want to get to meaningful property tax relief for homeowners plus the ag industry as well. They're seeing incredible increases in property.
26.4% from last year to this year is what the average increase for a farmer of property taxes that they've had to pay. That's insane.
Correct. And it's going to be 20%, and it was actually 20% the
year before?
The year before.
Oh my gosh.
And if we don't do anything, it's going to be 20% next year.
So in 3 years, they're going to basically see their property taxes on average go up about 60 to 70%.
Yeah. So a little, and you got to remember that's compounding.
Yeah.
It's just like interest compounds. That's going to compound on that as well. So
you can't survive if you're a small farmer and the government's coming in. John Marshall, he was the second Supreme Court justice in American history. He said, the power to tax is the power to destroy. And I think that is something that we all have to remember as legislators and as government officials. It's a very serious responsibility, and we have not done a good job in Indiana. Now, to our credit, we do better at destroying less than some states around us. So we're not the worst of the culprits in the 50-state union. However, we could do better.
We can do much better. And so my goal this session is to get to a landing spot where homeowners across the state see a lower tax bill next year than what they're going to receive this year.
Yeah.
Tax bills are already going to start coming out here soon for this year. We can't change this year's tax bill, but we can change next year's. And so I want to see a reduction for next year's tax bills, relief to the ag as well. We can't shift the tax burden from homeowners to ag because ag is seeing a large increase as well. But then ultimately, I think we need to restructure the system. I think it's time to hit the reset button. If you were to design a property tax system or just a taxing structure in general, how are we going to fund local units of government? I don't think anybody in their right mind would create the system that we have today.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a 130-year-old plus system that's been tweaked every handful of years.
Every decade.
And every time there's a tweak, you really don't get rid of the old system, so it just further complicates it. So that's why I introduced the bill to repeal and replace the property tax system.
I think property taxes, and we have to be honest with ourselves, I think they're immoral because our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, penned the Declaration of Independence, and in it he tells us that there are 3 God-given inalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But he took that from John Locke, who 100 years earlier had penned and said those 3 inalienable rights are life, liberty, and property. And the reason Jefferson changed property to pursuit of happiness was he didn't want slave owners to somehow think that owning slaves was a God-given right. So, but the founders believed you couldn't pursue happiness if you weren't able to own property. That's why when guys like Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum say stupid stuff like you will own nothing and be happy, what he's doing is he's literally going against the laws of nature according to Jefferson and Locke, right? And so if we are building off of this premise that property is a God-given inalienable right, then what's the difference of taxing somebody's property as opposed to their life?
Right.
Or your liberty, right? The government should then be able to come in and say, well, JD, you're alive, so you need to pay us
Right.
X percent, right? Or you have liberty, so you need to pay us for your liberty,
Yep,
right?
absolutely.
And we'd all say, no, that's egregious. You can't do that. Like, you have no right to tax me on something that God gives me. You don't give us that,
Right.
government. So I think we have to be honest with ourselves and say, hey, property taxes, the reason we can't fix it was because it's out of God's right order, right? We'll never fix it until we actually get back to the right order, which is don't tax it at all.
Correct.
Yeah.
And it's also a tax on unrealized gains too.
Oh, I
We've been
hate that.
fighting that at the national level
terrible.
with
Yep.
mainly with stocks. But I mean, if you think about it, this is, if you own a property, you don't plan on selling it. If you've owned it for 30 years, it's went up in value. You're being taxed on that gain that you're not going to cash in on until you
terrible.
sell it or until you die and somebody inherits it, right? So
I hate being taxed on unrealized gains. It's not fair, and it disincentivizes me to want to see my assets grow, right? And the government always seems to disincentivize good behavior, and they incentivize bad behavior.
Yep.
And so I think you're spot on with that. The unrealized gains is just the most egregious part of this, and then it reminds me of the biblical history. You go back to the Roman era. You know why tax collectors were hated so much is because they could do that. They could create an assessed value within their own relative sphere of thinking that you're worth something. And then when they tell you you're worth that, well, last year you were worth $100,000, JD. This year I think you're worth $200,000. I just assessed the value, and you have to pay me on the $200,000.
Right.
And then the tax collectors got to keep whatever was above what Rome demanded of the tax collector. So there was this assessed value nonsense going all the way back to the time of Rome, and people hated it because they couldn't see it coming, just like what we can't see our tax bills coming until we open up that letter from the assessor and we see, oh my gosh, what has happened? And somehow they've assessed it at some weird value based on what my neighbor did to his house. I haven't touched my house, but my neighbor does something to his house or sells his house, and now the assessor gets to say, oh, well, that means your house is worth more now too. Now pay me up what you owe me, or else we're going to take your house from you. This is no different than 2,000 years ago, and that's why we've got to fix it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's good stuff, man. I appreciate the fight. The last thing, and I'm passionate about this bill, is, which bill I'm probably going to say. So tell me where the Harry Hoosier bill is at.
Yeah, so Harry Hoosier unfortunately didn't make it across this year in the first half as well. But this is a fun one, and it's to really honor Harry Hoosier, who is an evangelical preacher back in the early days of our country. Traveled the country with Francis Asbury, and the followers of his teaching were known as Hoosiers, and that's really how we got our Hoosier nickname. And so as he was traveling, he was illiterate. Harry was illiterate, and so he actually memorized Scripture, most of the New Testament, and most of the Old Testament as well. But he memorized all of Scripture. He was known as one of the best orators.
And you forgot to say, he was a freed black slave.
Yes.
So he was a black evangelical preacher who memorized the Bible, preached with guys like Francis Asbury. John Adams talks about Harry Hoosier. Benjamin Rush talks about Harry Hoosier being one of the greatest orators of the founding era. And so he would minister to guys who were coming out to the new territory, the Indiana, Ohio region, and people would say, what's wrong with those guys? They don't cuss as much, they don't drink as much, they don't steal as much or whatever. It's like, oh, well, those guys have become Christians because they're Hoosiers guys. They've listened to Hoosiers teaching. That's where the name came from. Yeah.
And it was meant as a derogatory term at that time, for some of them. And it's interesting when you go back and look at the teachings of Harry Hoosier. He primarily got started teaching to the black congregations. He's an African American preacher, so he would teach to the black congregations. But he built up such a following that the crowds at his services exceeded Francis Asbury and some of the others that he traveled along with. The white congregation would go, and they'd rather listen to Harry because he was such a great orator. He could really spell it out. And there was a redemption piece as well with this Harry. Later in life, Harry became a drunkard. And but then he did repent back to the Lord and got clean and went back to Christ and living the life of Christ. So there's also a redemption.
So there's a lot of grace in Harry's story. I think that's fantastic, and it undermines the leftist narrative that America was inherently a racist nation. Mm-hmm. America is a secular nation, right? It's like we had a black freed slave preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, And we, as people who live in Indiana, our namesake being Hoosier, it comes right from Harry Hoosier. Yep. And I just think that is so important and critical to teach up our children to say, hey, you're named after a black, freed evangelist.
Yep, absolutely.
And I think, to me, that's awesome. I'd love to see, Harry Hoosier honored in the 250th celebration that President Trump is putting on. I'd love to see him, posthumously awarded, just awards of honor, just because I think he really embodies what Indiana is known for, being a faith and family and freedom state. And so I love that bill. I think we gotta work hard to get it across the finish line next year. I think people look at it kind of like the state sandwich, and I don't think it's that at all. I think this actually plays into our heritage, and we need to solidify this once and for all. Just say, hey, this is where it comes from. The other nonsensical ideas of where Hoosier comes from is just dumb. Like a bar fight, someone loses their ear and they pick up an ear and like, whose ear is this? Or someone knocks on the door, who's there? Like stuff like that has no historical precedent. It's just sort of urban myth, urban legend, and yet Harry Hoosier it's recorded. He's talked about from our founders. He had an influence on the men that were hunting in this area. It makes perfect sense logically that that's where we get our namesake from.
Yeah, if you look at all the stories, this is the only one that has historical significance and documentation to actually back up the namesake. And I think the most important part is we need to remember not only was our nation founded in faith, but our state was founded in faith.
I love it.
And maybe that's something we could do in a future podcast to go back through and with our nation being founded in faith and how our founders really incorporated biblical principles into writing and drafting the Constitution.
Yeah.
That's an idea.
I love it. Let's do it. You don't have to twist my arm on that one. Okay. All right. Sounds good. Thanks, man. Appreciate it. All right. Sweet. Yeah. What'd you think?
Yeah. Thank you. That was fun.
Cool.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So I think we're going to do this every week, and we'll.